Editing messages is something right now we haven't really implemented. I can click edit, but this will only change the value here. Well, now I want to have the functionality that once I click edit, I load the message here in the input field, I can change it, and then save it back to the database. I also want to have a button which allows me to, well, cancel the editing process. And not only do I want to have this process, which is 100% front-end only, I also want to store whatever I enter here as a new value to the database. Of course, only if I save and not if I cancel. So let's implement this starting with the front end. If we have a look at the message list component, which is the component rendering all our messages, and then at the message component, which is the individual message, we see this onEdit method, which executes or which emits this edit clicked event here. This event is then handled by the message list component here, where I listen to this custom event. Well, and then here I simply change the content. I don't want to use this setup anymore. I want to edit the actual message in the array and then save it to the database. So I'll delete this in the message list component where I listen to my own event. And in the message component, I will delete this output and the event emitter. I also no longer need to import event emitter and output therefore, since I don't use it. Now I want to do all of that in the service, in the message service. So I'll get rid of this line, which doesn't work right now. And back in the message service, it's time to work on that. Here, I want to add a new method, which I'll call edit message. To this method, I want to pass the message which should get edited. And I will call this message from my message component. Now, all I want to do here though is I want to inform the message input component that it should now load this message into this input here in the HTML template so that I'm able to, well, change it. So in order to do this, I will add a new property here, an event emitter, and I will call it message is added. Of course, you may choose whatever name you like. This will be a new event emitter. Of course, therefore, you will need to import it from @AngularCore. And it will emit a message object. It will emit, a message object in the end. So with this setup, I can go to my edit message method where I call this message is added and emit this event. And here I want to pass the message which is sent to this method. Why do I set it up like this? Because this service will now act as a middleman between the message component, which will now simply use this service and call edit message and pass the message of this component, this message of course, and the input component where I want to listen to this. So here I will implement onInit lifecycle hook, which also needs to be imported from @AngularCore, to add the ng-onInit method, which is the perfect place to now call this message service messages added, so this event, and subscribe to any events which may get emitted, so that this message input component gets informed whenever in some other component I click the edit button. Now what do I want to do once the edit button is clicked? I want to load this message into my input field. Now, of course, if we have a look at the message input component template, right now we're not really using any pre-filled values. This is always empty. We don't have a possibility to fill this input with our own value. Time to add this functionality. In the TypeScript file in the class body, I'll create a new property called message, which will represent the message loaded into the input field. This is of type message. And by default, it is of course undefined, because by default the field should be empty. So there is no message pre-filled into this field, because the default is that we create a new message. But I can hook up this input field with this ng model here by adding squared brackets. Not squared brackets and parentheses. I don't want to set up two-way binding. I don't want to update the message property of this component on every keystroke, but I want to pre-fill it if this message property we set up here, if this is not undefined, then I want to fill the value into this input field. This is what ngModel here does. Though of course I want to target the content of this message, and I pass a question mark to only do this if it is not undefined, in which case of course there is no content field to access. So if the message property here is undefined, as it is by default, there will be no value in my input field. But if we do have a value for message, if it is set to something else than undefined or null, well then we will see the content of this message. So here back to the ngOnInit method where I subscribe to my messages added event. Here I can simply say, well, for each message I get passed, since I know I will get a message passed to this callback, so it is of type message, since that is what this event emitter is set up to emit. In this case, if we receive such a data, if this event is fired, then I want to set this message equal to the message I get passed through the event emitter. Now let's save this and already see this in action. If I reload my application here and I click on edit, see this? We already load test. Though right now, if I click save, I created a new object, as you will see once I reload. So this doesn't really work, it doesn't really save it. Also, I got no way of clearing this input, and well, of course I can clear it like this, but then I have the red button. So this needs some more fine-tuning. The fine-tuning I want to apply to this input field here is, I want to have a clear button, which allows me to reset the form. And I want to, once I click the save button, not save it as a new message, but instead update the existing one. I'll need a new method in my service for this. Well, let's start with resetting the form. Here in the onSubmit method, I already call form reset form when I click save. So this is done, but I want to have this cancel button. Here, I want to add a new button to my input component to this form. So I'll quickly do this. I'll add a button, which is of type button, so that it doesn't submit this form. And it will get the Bootstrap classes button and button danger to make it red. And here I'll simply say clear. And what this clear button does is it will execute the onClear method in my input component body here. So here we have onClear. And what do I want to do here in onClear? Well, let's call form reset form, and in order to be able to do so, I need to pass my form here, of course, which I can do since I have access to it with this f reference, so I can pass it just like I pass it to the onSubmit method. Let's save this and see if it does what we want. If I reload my application here, click edit, we see the clear button. If I click clear, it clears the form and I am not able to submit this anymore. So this resets it and this clears the value. So that does what I wanted to do. But still, we're not able to really update an existing message instead of saving a new one. So let's work on this now. I have to work in the onSubmit method, which is the place where I currently call the addMessage method in the service. Well, I don't have an update message method yet, but I can already implement the logic here to decide which method in the service should get called. So here I will add an if statement where I simply check if this message is not null or undefined. Because if this message is null or undefined, then I know we're creating a new message. But if it is not null or undefined, so in this case here, we're editing. Otherwise, we're creating. So if we're creating, well, then I want to execute this code. Form reset form will stay outside because I want to execute this in both cases. But if we're editing, then I simply want to set this message content to the content of my form value, content field here. So of the content field in my form. this single input I have here. And then I want to call a method in the message service which allows me to really update my message. So let's create such a method in the service here. I'll name it update message. So this is not the method loading the message, it's the one which really changes it. And it expects to get the message which should get updated. Now what do I need to do here? Right now, nothing. I'll soon add the HTTP methods to reach out to the server and change it here. But to change it on the front end, I don't need to do anything here. We already got all the functionality we want. We're already editing this message content and set it equal to form value content. Remember, this message here, the message we use in this input component, comes from this global array where we manage all the messages. We get it here when we listen to the event. And therefore, if we change the message here, the one in the array is changed, since we're only using arrays and objects here, so only reference types. We're not changing a copy, we're changing the actual message. So let's see this in action. If I save this and let it recompile and I load my application here, if I click edit and I change it to test2 and save this, now you see no new message was added. Instead, this one here was edited. And if I reload, you also see we didn't add a new one. Of course, the edit didn't persist because, well, we're not storing it in the database. But we're now in the edit mode here. But the strange thing is the form is not reset, so let's see why this happens. The form does not reset because this message is changed here. So we're setting this message here, and that means it's not undefined or null. So we need to call this message equals null here to set this object back to null, in which case we will no longer output anything here since message is now null and we don't access the content. And therefore, to make everything work correctly, we also need to do the same here in the onClear method. So here we also need to set this to null. What this will do is that if I click on edit and I clear and edit again, it now also sets this to null in between. If I wouldn't reset this to null here too, then you will see that if you click edit and clear, it clears it, but if you click edit again, it won't load it. So with this, we get the form set up, we're able to edit it and to really change it. Now it's time to work on the back end and allow us to save these changes we're making on the front end to our database on the back end.